James Bradberry heads to Philadelphia, Jadeveon Clowney returns to Cleveland, and the Packers extend Jaire Alexander. All that and more on today's episode of Locked On NFL.
You are Locked On NFL, your daily NFL podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another episode of the Locked On NFL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, so that means you have me, Kevin Ostreicher, the host of Locked On Ravens. And today's episode of Locked On NFL is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline is who covered this season with more props, odds, and lies than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. And thank you for making Locked On NFL your first listen of the day. We're free and available on all platforms, including on YouTube. We have a ton to dive into today. We're going to be talking about James Bradberry, talking about Jadeveon Clowney, and of course, Jaire Alexander. So first, we'll be talking with Louie DiBiase of Locked On Eagles about the signing of James Bradberry, followed then by Garrett Bush of Locked On Browns about the Jadeveon Clowney reunion, Clowney going back to Cleveland. Then finally, Peter Bukowski of Locked On Packers joins us to talk about the Jaire Alexander extension. So without any further ado, let's get into our conversation with Louie DiBiase about James Bradberry. Joining me here now, one of the hosts of Locked On Eagles, Louie DiBiase. And Louie, I know we talked a couple weeks ago about the Eagles draft and their acquisition of A.J. Brown. Well, the Eagles acquiring another great player, this time James Bradberry. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good, Kevin. Yeah, the Eagles really know how to create the offseason into an exciting few months every single time. And sometimes it doesn't always work out. 2011, the Dream Team, 2015, Chip Kelly's version of the Dream Team, 2019. Sometimes it implodes, but the offseason on paper always tends to look good for the Eagles outside of 2020. So, yeah, on paper, again, love the work they're doing, and that continues with Bradberry.
Yeah, and let's kind of dive into that a little bit because obviously Bradberry was a player who I think a lot of teams would have liked to have had, and he's a guy who's been shopped around a little bit, obviously during his time with the Giants, the end of that tenure, and then on the free agent market, I think a lot of teams could have really used his services. The Eagles being the team that ends up winning out. Did you feel like this was a move that you expected for the Eagles, whether it was going back to his time on the trade market during the end of that Giants tenure when he hit free agency? How expected of a move was this for you?
Yeah, I think when after the draft, the Eagles did not come away with a single defensive back. They chose Jordan Davis over Kyle Hamilton in the first round. There wasn't a corner or safety that fell to them in the second round, and then Kobe Dean's there in round 3. You got to jump on that. So overall, I love the work the Eagles did this offseason, but you were really nervous because you're like, geez, I mean, right now at cornerback opposite Darius Slay, you've got a 4th-round pick from 2021 and Zach McPherson, who barely played at all last year, and then a bunch of undrafted kids. There was just no proven ability, and you're like, that could really hold this team back from getting to the ceiling that they potentially possess. And so when James Bradberry became available, when the Giants released him, I'm like, you have to jump on this. It's obvious. This is a 28-year-old corner that was a Pro Bowler just 2 years ago to be your CB2. Ideal. I just thought there was going to be a lot of competition, like the Kansas City Chiefs, the Las Vegas Raiders, a lot of teams that are in win now mode that would pay more money than Philadelphia was willing to pay. But Bradberry wanted to bet on himself, sign a 1-year prove-it deal worth up to $10 million, a little under $8 million guaranteed, and he signs with the Eagles. And I think that kind of completes what was an amazing offseason. That was the missing link in that secondary on defense. And again, Bradberry had an up-and-down season last year, but if you get the 2019-2020 version of Bradberry, you might have one of the best duos of corners with Slay and Bradberry in the entire NFL.
Yeah, you have multiple great players there now, and I think the addition really elevates this Eagles defense to a level where obviously without Bradberry, you're still kind of wondering, all right, who's the guy next to Darius Slay? But let's talk about that contract a little bit, Louie, because you mentioned it 1 year, up to $10 million. How surprised were you that they were able to get that deal with him for a guy that probably had a pretty good market heading into free agency?
Yeah, again, I was pretty surprised because when a 28-year-old, this doesn't have to be a Band-Aid signing where you sign him to a 1-year deal while you wait to draft his replacement next year and then he moves on. He's some 32-year-old. Philadelphia has tried that a lot over the past 4 off seasons, especially on the defensive side of the football, because they're investing so many high draft picks on offense. The defense kind of suffered, so you had to make it work with the core you already had, and then a lot of those Band-Aid signings. Bradberry, that doesn't have to be the case. I was surprised that, again, he didn't cash in still, but it makes sense. Like, again, he had a down year in 2021 in comparison to what he did the previous 2 seasons. So he wanted to bet on himself, and the Eagles took advantage. But again, this doesn't have to be a 1-year rental for $10 million. I think, again, at 28 years old, if he's having a great first half of the season, Howie Roseman, the Eagles love to make that, halfway through the year contract extension. They did it with Alshon Jeffrey and Timmy Jernigan back in 2017. This past year, they did it with Josh Sweat and Jordan Mailata, Dallas Goedert. So I think Bradberry doesn't have to be a rental, but I was surprised that they got him for that kind of value on a 1-year deal.
Right. And he, I think, is going to slot in very nicely on this defense, too. And it benefits him and the Eagles, that signing, because obviously he bets on himself now. And if he does have that great first half, as you were talking about, he can cash out with another big deal with Philadelphia. But you see this now with like Jarvis Landry, Jadeveon Clowney, now James Bradberry, guys all taking 1-year deals now when teams don't necessarily have the same amount of money to throw around that they did in March and April leading up to the draft. So it benefits the teams, it benefits the players. And now Bradberry gets a chance to thrive in that Eagles defense. But Louie, where does he slot in? I mentioned, the Darius Slay connection. Now it's going to be Slay and Bradberry. But what does he allow this Eagles defense to do now with his acquisition?
Yeah, again, I think Howie Roseman has added more defensive talent this year for the short term and long term than he has in quite some time, because again, they were investing so much in the offense. The defense was suffering with talent, but all the talent was up front in the front 7. Again, it was Nakobe Dean, it was Hassan Riddick, it was Jordan Davis, it was Kazir White, it was linebackers and defensive linemen. So you're saying, okay, this defense really does have a high ceiling, but if they do not fill this boundary corner spot opposite Darius Slay, this is going to be a significant liability in an NFL where teams throw the football more than ever before. So James Bradberry is going to pencil in as the starting outside corner. He's going to replace Steven Nelson from last year, who signed with the Houston Texans this year in free agency. So it's going to be Darius Slay on the outside with James Bradberry, and then Avonte Maddox in the slot. And Kevin, that really does help. Having that trio of corners, I think, is the best the Eagles have had in over a decade, considering safety right now is also a weakness. They brought back Anthony Harris on a 1-year deal, but he was kind of a non-factor in 2021. And then they have a new starter in Marcus Epps, who's been a role player for them and special teams player over the last few years. So Bradberry on the boundary now with Slay and Maddox inside is going to be so crucial to not hold back the front 7's potential and also make up for what they don't have at safety.
Right. It helps them in multiple different aspects, and just having as many good players as you can there, especially when it can fill a weakness coming out of the draft where you're thinking maybe they are going to draft a couple guys at the cornerback position. And then they come out with none, a couple good undrafted guys, but you have a couple other ones as well. But Louie, the NFL schedule coming out in the Eagles, they have, I think, their hands full in a couple aspects. That NFC East division is one where I think it's still pretty wide open, even though Dallas kind of ran away with it in 2021. How'd you feel like their schedule went for them?
Yeah, overall, I thought it was really well balanced. I think, over the years, the Eagles have had a really tough start to the season, and then the division games were really stacked to the bottom. So they were able to go on runs. Last year, you win 4 straight to make the playoffs. In 2019, it was the same thing, 4 straight to win the NFC East. 2018, you had to win 5 of 7 to make the playoffs. So they've really started off slow over the past few years. But this year, I think you have an opportunity to start off hot. And really, there isn't this giant gauntlet. Like last year in November, they had to play Patrick Mahomes and Tom Brady and Justin Herbert and Derek Carr. This year, you don't really have that gauntlet of star quarterbacks. Outside of Aaron Rodgers, the best quarterback they play is Kyler Murray, and then it gets to Carson Wentz and Trevor Lawrence, Kirk Cousins. So overall, I think that, it's on paper, and you never know how good NFL teams are in the month of May. But on paper, the schedule looks pretty well balanced. There's not a lot of crazy tough stretches or road runs and where they're, short on rest and the other team's coming off a bye. So overall, I was really happy with the schedule, and I can't wait for some of these reunions. Carson Wentz coming back week 10, Doug Peterson coming back week 4. They take on Zach Ertz. So there's a lot of revenge and reunion games I'm really looking forward to.
This Eagles team certainly very well equipped to at least make a run in that NFC East. And I think with all the schedule nuances that go on with every single team, the Eagles, I think, have a decently, you say quote unquote easy one, but you never know how the teams will end up stacking up come September, October, November. And obviously you have December there, but the Eagles team looking very different than it did before the draft. A lot of new playmakers added, and that includes James Bradberry. But Louie, thanks so much for hopping on with me today. It was a blast.
Appreciate it, Kevin. Thank you.
The second appearance for Louie here in a couple of weeks. As first, we talked about A.J. Brown in the Eagles draft a couple weeks ago. Now talking about James Bradberry, the Eagles staying very, very busy over the course of the 2022 offseason, but still a ton to talk about here on Locked On NFL. We're going to talk next with Garrett Bush of Locked On Browns about Jadeveon Clowney returning to Cleveland, so don't go anywhere. But first, I do want to tell you a bit about Bet Online, and our partners at Bet Online do continue to be the number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. In the NBA playoffs, they've been great this playoff season. I mean, there have been some blowout games that haven't been as exciting, but there have been some amazing games as well. And with Bet Online, you can find the latest odds, news, and sports developments, including this year's basketball playoffs, which are still going on. You have Major League Baseball scores, you have fights, and even the futures for the NFL next season, they're starting to come out. So Bet Online is a continued source for all your sports wagering information from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. So head to the website today. Use a mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. Bet Online, where the game starts. And we return here with our second segment of Locked On NFL. Kevin Oestreicher, your host, still here with you. And thank you for making Locked On NFL your first listen of the day. Now be sure to make your second listen Locked On Sports today. But now we're going to be diving into our conversation with Garrett Bush of Locked On Browns about Jadeveon Clowney returning to Cleveland. So let's dive into that now. Joining me now is one of the hosts of Locked On Browns, Garrett Bush. And Garrett, this signing of Jadeveon Clowney, which we'll talk about here, one that I think is really great for the Cleveland Browns. How you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. I think it's a great signing for the Browns. I was a little nervous. It got down to the nitty gritty, but I just remember how Clowney usually does in an offseason. He doesn't like to come to camps. So I thought this was going to, go down to the wire. So I'm really glad that the Browns did sign this deal, and we can look forward to getting some other things ironed out and figuring out what we do at some other positions.
Right, exactly. And Clowney does, I think, add this element to Cleveland's defense, obviously, which is ability to set the edge, also obviously rush the pass. But Garrett, was this something that you expected Cleveland to do? Obviously, Clowney being a free agent was on the market for a pretty long time. You mentioned he doesn't really like to go to the camps, but was this something that you thought that Cleveland was going to get done, especially with OTAs and training camp now on the horizon a little bit?
Oh yeah, I definitely thought they would get it done. When Deshaun Watson came back, I think it really sped up the clock a little bit, and I think it really turned a lot of free agents around. You had Baker Mayfield. There was a lot of people in that locker room that weren't happy with the way the season went. A lot of people were really big fans of Odell Beckham Jr. He goes out, he leaves, goes to LA. He plays the best football of his season. Had to learn a new system. He wins a Super Bowl, and the Browns looked at it like, wow, that was supposed to be us. That was supposed to be us out there doing those things. And so, Baker Mayfield thing happens, and then Deshaun Watson is on the radar. And when they signed Deshaun Watson, I think Jadeveon Clowney turned around and said, okay, this is a great opportunity for me now. Before, if we were to look at the team and say, what do you need? You still needed a quarterback. They had already got Amari Cooper. They got Deshaun Watson. And so I felt he looked at them and said, wow, I got Myles Garrett on the other end. I had one of my best years of my career playing with Myles Garrett. You still got one of the best backfields in the league. And it's a really deep backfield with Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb. You also have upgraded. You signed Denzel Ward. Newsome looks like a nice corner. JOK and some of the other guys that are rookies really showed up and gave you some flashes last year. So if you're Jadeveon Clowney, you're like, I might as well go ahead and just run this back real quick just to see what it was looking like, because push come to shove, I'm still going to be single team because it's Myles Garrett on the other side of me.
Right. If you want to partner on the other side, you cannot go wrong with having Myles Garrett on that opposite side of you. And it's crazy because 1 year, $11 million. I know the reports have been there are multiple teams offering a multi-year deal for a little bit more in the average annual value range, but Clowney turns it down to come back to Cleveland. So, Garrett, how much value is this for Cleveland in terms of the actual logistics of this contract?
I think it's tremendous value. I think when you look at the open market, I thought it was value was somewhere around 13 or maybe even higher, like $14 million. I was expecting him to sign a 2-year deal or 2 or 3 year deal, something from another team, or possibly the Browns offer him that amount of money in a contract. But when I saw the contract length and what it was, another 1-year deal, $11 million. And I think Jadeveon Clowney likes to bet on himself. He says, hey, last year turned out pretty well for myself. I've had one of my better years, 9 sacks, playing amongst Myles Garrett, playing on the defense where you have a lot of freedom under Joe Woods. He figured, hey, let's go back and do it again. If you can, and if the Browns can make it deep in a deep playoff run, or he can really up his sack totals and say get it around 15 sacks. Now all of a sudden you got a 1-year deal. You come back next year, you get another bite at the apple, and now you can get you. Now you're commanding top 3 defensive linemen in the free agency pool. You can be getting 17, 18 million a year because some team's going to overpay for that type of production, especially with the athletic ability of Jadeveon Clowney. So I think it's supreme. You get a lot of value in this pick for 1 year, $11 million.
Right. And I think the ability for him to have a chance to win now in this year and then hit the market again, that's great, as you talked about, where it benefits both Cleveland and Clowney at the same time. So great value all around, really. But Garrett, what does Clowney bring on the field? You had the chance to watch him in Cleveland and what he was able to bring opposite of Myles Garrett. So what is he bringing now that he's back with the Browns?
Well, I took a look at some stats, and when they talk about the pressures are what really get to people. There's a game against the Chicago Bears. I really dug down deep into this game. Myles Garrett had 5 sacks in that game. He had 7 pressures, 5 sacks, and his get off when they clocked him in his get off was at 0.76. So that means in 0.76, he's off the ball, ready to go. And you can see how he got 5 sacks. But on the other end of the spectrum, you look at what Jadeveon Clowney was able to do. He didn't have a 0.76. He just had a 0.96. So that's still under a second. By the time you count to 1,000, these guys are upfield. So when you look at that, and in that game, he didn't do bad at all. I mean, he only had 2 sacks, and he had more pressures than Myles Garrett with 8. So what you look at is when you get guys that are getting to get off like that, exploding upfield, and you were in obvious passing downs, it gives the Cleveland Browns one of the most formidable pass rushing tandems in the league. Not only are you able to do that, you have to look at the guys that can consistently extend plays. Joe Burrow's a guy that can extend plays. Lamar Jackson is the new Mike Vick, and that guy is he just makes people look silly with his athletic ability. So when you have 2 defensive ends that can rush and that can run at the same time, I really think it gives you a lot of different things you could do with your pressure packages, dropping guys, moving them, kicking them down into a 3 technique and rushing. So he brings a versatility to the Cleveland Browns defense.
Yeah, Clowney, a very important piece, I think, also to the Cleveland Browns defense, which is huge for them. But Garrett, now that the Clowney signing is done, what's next for Cleveland in your eyes? What do you feel like they should address? Is there a position in particular or a couple where you feel like they might have to make another addition or 2?
Well, right now, they got this done. Now, think about it. They had already offered Jarvis Landry more money. I think it was almost $10 million. He took 6 to go down to New Orleans and go back home and play for the Saints. You look at Jadeveon Clowney. He was a guy that was looking at the market value being about $14 million a year. He comes for 1 year for $11 million. So now I'm looking at the funds here in the pockets. The next thing I think the Browns want to do is find a trading partner for Baker Mayfield. That may take a little bit longer, given the fact that, teams have already moved forward with their rookie quarterbacks. They've signed veterans. They look like they're pretty well, going to stay pat. Unless there's an injury or something, I don't expect Baker Mayfield to go anytime, within the next couple of months. It might be in training camp when he actually is moved. So that leaves, to me, I would say I look at the receiver position. They drafted David Bell in the 3rd round. Is David Bell the guy that you're going to count on to make plays? So you still have Donovan Peoples-Jones. You still have some of the younger guys, Anthony Schwartz. Can you get a Will Fuller? Can you get a vertical threat for a couple of $1 million to get in and come in here? And just in case the rookies don't pan out, I think wide receiver is a place that they look to fill in. And I think they'll give some of the rookies some time in camp. But some of those veterans will still be available, ready to go too. And if they can get one of those guys a vertical threat, I think that's the next step that they should take.
Yeah, there are a couple areas where Cleveland could improve, and their roster already very solid. But if they can just add those couple of pieces into a little bit of the holes on their roster, I think it becomes even more formidable. But Garrett, the NFL schedule came out. And Cleveland, obviously, with the AFC North being their division, it'll be tough with those teams, but also they have a couple of other very tough teams on the docket. How do you feel like their schedule played out with when they're playing, guys?
Well, I love their schedule. If you're looking for a suspension for Deshaun Watson, the first couple of games of the season, you look at what they got on the schedule. I believe they got the Jets, They don't even play the Steelers to the week 5, I believe. All of your guys, all of your teams that are within the first 4 games of the schedule are winnable games. They're games that you can win. The hardest games come, at the end of the year. I believe they're playing Buffalo. They got the Buccaneers this year. I'm really looking forward to those 2 games. But if you're looking at the first 4, even if you got a Jacoby Brissett playing the games, I still think that the Browns have a great opportunity to at least be 4-0, 3-1 if Deshaun Watson is going to get suspended. But I'm looking towards those first few games. I'll take that, and then it progressively gets going after that. And they got a traditional bye this year. Their bye was really late last year. I think it's right in the middle of the season, so it gives you a little bit of time to rest and get that 1-2 punch and just really focus on the second part of the season. So I really think I like the schedule. Where the Browns and like the rest of the AFC North have to make their hay is the 6 games against the division foes, and those will be knocked down dragouts because this division I think is year in year out one of the most toughest divisions in the league, and Baltimore and Baltimore and the Steelers have just continue to be there every single year. It's just about whether or not the Browns and the Bengals fluctuate back and forth, but obviously the Bengals are there this year with Joe Burrow, so going to be interested in watch some of those games. Those will be the games that I will be keeping my eye on.
Right. Now, I know there is a lot of uncertainty in the early season pending a potential Deshaun Watson suspension, but Cleveland's roster right now looking still very formidable and something that is certain. The Jadeveon Clowney back in Cleveland. Garrett, it was great talking with you. Thanks for hopping on here with me.
Appreciate you, man.
A big thanks to Garrett for hopping on talking with me about Jadeveon Clowney. It's a big addition, or I should say re-addition, to the Cleveland defense. But we still have a ton to talk about here on Locked On NFL. Coming up, we'll be talking with Peter Bukowski of Locked On Packers about that Jaire Alexander extension. So be sure to stay tuned. Still a ton to talk about here, of course, on Locked On NFL. But first, I do want to tell you a bit about Rock Auto, and this episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. And it can be impossible now for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need with so many increasing numbers of makes and models. And there can be really almost seemingly intimidating questioning or even pointless questioning, and you have to wait while the person behind the counter gets the parts from their computer, and you can only really choose the brand that the warehouse happens to carry because that's all they have. But now you have computers with access to rockauto.com at home and in your pocket. Now, Rock Auto is a family business, so they've been serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. Rock Auto prices are reliably low for every customer. They have brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, and even new carpet, so a lot of parts to choose from. You can explore their easy-to-use website today to find a solution to your auto parts needs. Go to rockauto.com right now. See all the parts available for your car or truck. Right, Locked On there. How'd you hear about us box? So we sent you amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. And we're back here with our final segment of Locked On NFL. Kevin Ostreicher, your host, still here with you. And thank you again for making Locked On NFL your first listen of the day. Be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube here in video form. And also, if you're with us in audio form, be sure to follow us anywhere you get your favorite podcast. But now here, we're going to talk with Peter Bukowski of Locked On Packers about the Packers extending Jaire Alexander. So let's dive into that conversation now. Here with me is the host of Locked On Packers, Peter Bukowski. And Peter, the Packers locking up Jaire Alexander to an extension, one of the best corners in the NFL. How you doing today?
I'm great. It is a great time in the Packers offseason because we finally get to talk about the players that are on the team versus the players that aren't, which is what we spend a lot of the offseason trying to do. So I'm glad that we get to talk about Jaire Alexander right now.
Right, and obviously he's a player that means so much to the Green Bay defense, and it's a good thing he'll be in Green Bay for a long time now for Packer fans. But how likely was this extension for you, especially around the timing here about mid-May, late May when it gets done? Was it something you were expecting kind of to come down the pipeline? Were you expecting it a bit earlier, a bit later, or even not at all?
So, it was going to happen. We were pretty sure this was going to get done. It was more a matter of when and then how much. So was he going to get top of market? I think that was a real question just because, he had the one elite season in 2020. He was incredible in 2020. And you go back to 2019, he was a very good player in 2018. You saw the flashes and they traded up. It's easier to forget now. They traded out of their original draft spot to get Jaire Alexander. They traded back up to get him after the Saints gave up way too much to get Marcus Davenport, and they passed on Derwin James to get Jaire Alexander ultimately. And you'd take Jaire Alexander in a first-round pick instead of Derwin James. I think 10 times out of 10. I'm certainly Packer fans are very happy with this deal. But we were just, to get that top of market, the Jalen Ramsey money, we weren't sure that was going to be quite what the numbers shook out to be. And we still haven't seen the specifics of the details in terms of the year by year numbers, in terms of, the devil is always in the details with these contracts, but he got a record-setting signing bonus, which was done to spread the money out over the Packers cap over the next 4 seasons. And it is still a record-setting number in terms of APY and in terms of what he's going to get over the length of this deal. And really, he's going to play every year of this deal. I mean, barring something crazy, Jaire Alexander is going to be on the Packers for the next 4 seasons on a monster deal. So we knew at the Combine that they had started discussions on a contract. It was more about where those numbers were going to land and then how much was he going to help the salary cap this season, because he was on that 5th year option. So he was counting on the Packers cap in that $13 million range. Well, even on a deal where he's going to make $21 million a year, he's not going to cost that much this season because he's got $1 million base salary. You've got all of that signing bonus money that you spread out, the $30 million in signing bonus. And so he's actually saving the Packers in that $6 to $7 million range this season on what he would have already cost. So it is the definition of, from a player's and a team's perspective, a win-win.
Yeah, I completely agree. And when looking at the actual logistics, 4 for 84, of course, 21 million per season, but not making that every single season, as you just talked about. How good of a deal was this for you with everything taken into account, that 1 million base salary in the first season? Were you happy with this deal for Green Bay?
So let me separate two things, because there is part of me that wants to be analytic about everything and say defense is a weak link system and no player is truly worth the elite money. What you should try and do is get a defense full of solid players and not worry about the elite players. Elite players, let them walk. There is an analytical part of me that says that. The same is true on the offensive line, which is also a weak link system. At the same time, there is also part of me that understands how people work, one, and number two, understands how football culture works. And if you are going to play as well as someone like Jaire Alexander is playing and has played, and you don't pay them, I think that creates an ugly precedent for your team. And you don't want to be the team that doesn't pay players who are worth it. I think it's one of the reasons why the Packers paid Aaron Jones, frankly, because the analytics say don't pay running backs. Listen, your team and the team that I cover both are let's invest in running back teams, apparently. And it has worked out for both of them. They've been perennial playoff contenders every season. They're two of the best front offices in football. So always going by the analytics is not always the best way to handle this, I think, frankly. Sometimes you just have to pay good football players. And I think paying good football players is a really good way to have a good team. Is if you consistently pay good players, you're going to have a good team, generally speaking. And he's an elite player at the position. I think you can make the case he's one of the 2 or 3 best players in the league at corner. Corner is a priority, a premium position, the way that we generally think about it. And so paying him this money, totally fine for me. I don't think at any point in this contract we are going to look back and go, this is like when Matt Ryan got a top of market deal. And he's the 12th best quarterback in the league. It's first of all, it's not that kind of money, and second of all, Jaire Alexander is 25. Like he's just going to get better, if anything. And there are only like 5 or 6 cornerbacks in the whole league that matter. That's the other thing, is these kinds of guys are hard to find. The Marlon Humphreys, the Jalen Ramseys, the AJ Terrells, the Jaire Alexanders, these guys are really, really hard to find. You don't understand it because the Ravens have just like Marlon Humphrey, Marcus Peters, like Jimmy Smith, just like whatever. We just have had these guys forever. But they re-signed Russell Douglas. They just drafted Eric Stokes, who was terrific as a rookie last season. Russell Douglas was a borderline Pro Bowl player last year with Jaire Alexander. That's a 1-2-3 that is as good as any 1-2-3 at cornerback in the league. Then you add in Darnell Savage and Adrian Amos at safety. I think you can make a very compelling case. No, I'll just say it. The Packers have the best secondary in football, and I think you can make a compelling case. Here's where I will use that terminology, that this is on paper the best defense in football. But certainly, I think secondary-wise, this is as good as it gets in the league right now.
Yeah, to have Jaire Alexander on a long-term contract, I mean, certainly for a secondary that is so fearsome, especially in that NFC North division and especially throughout the NFL. But Peter, what does he bring? What has he brought? And I mean, what now will he continue to bring to this Packers defense? Because obviously they paid him for a reason because he plays good football and is a phenomenal football player.
It's more than just being a good cover player, which he is. He is a fantastic cover corner. He can mirror, he can play the ball. He is, if you're just going to stick him on the number one guy all day, that's when you go back to 2018, he broke out covering Brandon Cooks against the Rams, where he was just phenomenal, sticky, and you went, oh, wait, this guy has a chance to be special. But it's so much more than that, Kevin, because he also brings that attitude in the run game. The play that Packer fans love the most of Jaire Alexander is he blew up a receiver screen against the Vikings a couple of years ago where he just ran through the receiver trying to block him, just ran through him and blew up the play. And it's just like, okay, this guy plays with attitude. He plays with swagger. He plays with ferocity. And you just don't get 5'10", 190 cornerbacks who play like that. And so to see a little guy and you know, little relatively speaking, right, play like that, there's something special about what he brings as a leader, as a culture setter, as a tone setter for your football team. And I think that's just another reason why a deal like this makes sense, because you want your program to spit out guys like Jaire Alexander. And he showed up fully formed like that. You want Eric Stokes to go to Jaire Alexander's school and come out like that guy, because if he does that, I mean, that's an all pro based on his physical tools and the upside that he has. So he has so much more value just beyond what he brings as a cover corner. He tackles, he plays physically, and he's going to play with force, with verve, with just an intensity that I think is unique for him at the position. And it does resonate. It permeates. You saw Russell Douglas last year, even when Jaire wasn't playing with just a joy and a passion. And that's something that I think is a result of what you're seeing from someone like 23 out there on the field.
Yeah, and now Alexander will have many more matchups with Justin Jefferson in that NFC North division, and the NFL with their schedule coming out for every team. Now, we knew who teams were going to play, but not when those games were. Peter, how do you feel like the Packers schedule fell for them?
So Warren Sharp does a cool thing where he looks at rest and who has rest versus when their opponents have rest. And the Packers schedule came out pretty disadvantageous for them. But when I look at just the teams and the stretches, I don't see any stretches where you're going, okay, there's 3 or 4 teams in a row that I worry about for Green Bay. It just doesn't really exist. Now there is, if you look late in the season, they have a Monday night stretch against the Rams coming off a bye. Then they have to go to Miami, and that's on a short week and it's late, you know, so like there's little quirks like that. They come back from London where they play the Giants and have to play that week. They don't have the bye after the London game. Is that going to affect them? I mean, maybe, but you know, the teams that they're playing, not too tough after that. That's the beauty of it. So it's almost like the NFL was like, okay, we're not going to give them a bye, but we're going to give them some teams that aren't very good. And so it's going to function a little bit like a bye. I look at their schedule and I'm going, why, even with Devontae Adams not being on the team, why don't they get to 12 or 13 wins? Who are the teams on their schedule that are a threat to beat them? And when you look at just the way that Las Vegas views all this, if you look at the win total futures on BetOnline, for example, and the teams that the Packers play, I think Green Bay is going to be favored in almost every game this season, with the exception of in Tampa. And, you know, we'll see, like, for example, the Vikings early in the season. Are people still buying a team like that? But there just aren't that many games where you're going, yeah, I think they're going to be the underdog in this game. It's just not going to happen. Now, they're going to lose some games where they're probably the underdog just because it's the NFL and that's how that works. I think they're going to win 12 or 13 games, and I think they're going to be right in the mix in the NFC. And I don't think the schedule really affects it that much.
Yeah, and for every team, it's like Green Bay will probably win a game that they're not expected to win, and they'll lose a game they're expected to win. It's the parody of the NFL and how everything works throughout that league. But what is for certain is the Packers have Jaire Alexander for a very long time. Will continue to be one of the best corners in the NFL playing for Green Bay. But Peter, this was great. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Of course.
A big thanks to Peter for talking Jaire Alexander with me. He's a piece in this Green Bay defense that's obviously super, super important. He should continue that high level of play for multiple years in a Green Bay uniform. But that's all I have for you here today on Locked On NFL. Thank you so much for joining me. When we get back here tomorrow on the show, we'll be diving into more NFL content with your Tuesday host. So be sure to stay tuned for that, and we will see you right back here tomorrow.